Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 486, Taxed. This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by its listeners. Many thanks and much gratefulness to all of the listeners who have gone over to patreon.com/craftlit and pledged their support to the show. We couldn't do it without you. Thank you. Well, hello. It is going to be a short episode today because tax season. Next week more, but this week, short chapter, short episode. Let's hop to it. First, I do have crafty things for you. I have 3 websites for you to go and take a look at. I met 3 really lovely young men who have recently graduated from UArts in Philadelphia, the university that my son will be going to, and they have been doing some really interesting things on their own. It's kind of amazing the way the world of the interwebs has completely changed the way, I think, especially art schools wound up having to look at students and students' life after art school. And they are quite entrepreneurial and really interesting. And especially if you have kids who like that game Magic, the card game, I think you might find some art that you're interested in. Actually, one of them, if you like any card games, he makes card decks and they are gorgeous. So have a look at what these 3 lovely young men are doing. You can find links to their web pages at craftlit.com/486. I've also been fiddling around more with different kinds of English paper piecing templates. And I'm very close to getting some, I think, made. There will be a link to the company that makes the templates, but also I will have a picture that I pulled off of Pinterest of the most amazing English paper pieced quilt pattern. It's Escher-like. That's how cool. That's what happened to my brain while I was working on the taxes. I can't handle this anymore. I'll go to Pinterest. What do I find? The most complex quilt pattern I've ever seen. It's really cool. All right, so there's all of that. There's also a mention of knitting in today's chapter, so that's fun too. Before we dive all the way in, we have a voicemail from listener Lise.
Hi, Heather. This is Lise calling about Anne of Green Gables. I've got a couple of comments, one of which is about my relationship with the book in general, and one is about Mrs. Barry. I did read this book, not the whole answers, when I was a kid, and I remember completely empathizing with Anne, and I remember, just internally howling at the injustice of Mrs. Barry at this point. And listening to it now, as an adult, my reaction is very different. I can still, of course, feel for poor Anne. That's terrible, and it's not her fault, and it is very unjust. At the same time, we have Mrs. Barry, who early on, we know, disapproves of Diana reading so much. And now, when she has a small child coming up to her and using those big words, her internal gut reaction is that she's being made fun of. She's having a flashback moment, hon. Something happened to her when she was a kid, and for some reason, not made to be aware that she didn't have the brains, and made to feel belittled. Somehow something happened that made her feel that all these people who were letting her know they were smarter than her and were making fun of her, this must have happened to this woman at some point. And, so maybe it's just a lack of education and awareness of it, but she's got this enemy in her own home, or this kid in her own home who she sure is passing her, and she's got this little girl who's rubbing it in. Obviously, this is not a measured response. This is a kick in the gut response. I find it hard to have no sympathy for this woman. She's not, I don't see her as a villain. I don't think it's that kind of story. So, yeah, I can have sympathy for her without having any sympathy for her response to the child. And I was kind of surprised you couldn't, but maybe you just didn't. I'm someone who, as a child, as a middle-aged child, middle school year child, had that reaction of I'm being teased when it wasn't necessarily happening. I had been teased when I was younger to the point where I couldn't trust it in early middle school years when somebody was being friendly to me if I didn't know them. So I recognized that kind of response. I got over it. She hasn't, but I can sympathize with her too. Doesn't mean she reacted that way to poor Anne, but I can't as an adult be completely mad at Mrs. Barrett either. So agree to disagree. Bye.
So that really made me think about my intolerance towards Mrs. Barry, and I really like Lisa's interpretation of how Miss Barry behaves. And I am sure that you're right, Lise, because it makes perfect sense. I think my immediate reaction is actually some low level of anger when I come across people who have every opportunity, they have the means and the opportunity to be educated, because nobody's stopping you from reading, and nobody's stopping you from, in these days, watching YouTube, which honestly, there is some really great educational content out there. You can learn anything. I get irked when I see people who seem to be saying, I can't be bothered, I'm not interested, I don't want to know. And I know that's a huge character flaw, but that's honest. That said, I totally get what you're saying about the suddenly having this interloper in your home who's siding with your child, looking like it's against you, siding with your husband, looking like it's against you. That read on it, I think, makes perfect sense. I think the other thing that's probably happening in my lizard brain is having seen parents when I was teaching who, I mean, growing up, I was surrounded by parents who wanted their children to be better, to do better, to have a better life, all of that. And that was a positive. That was a sign that you'd done a good job as a parent when your kid could excel and maybe surpass whatever you'd done in your life. I did come across a subset of parents who really got angry at their kids for doing better than they had. So I think I'm having that reaction to Mrs. Barry. All of that said, we don't know yet where Lucy Maud Montgomery is taking our characters. There's certainly a lot of character arc learning that goes on, and I wouldn't be surprised if Miss Barry gets involved in that too. We've already seen a change in Miss Rachel. We're going to find out a little bit more about her next week too. But thank you for bringing that up. That really made me think a lot. I know I'm going to change my mind like 16 times before I record the next episode or even finish recording this one. But that was really good. Thought-provoking. Thank you. Let's get to the chapter stuff. All right. Chapter 17. Anne is still home at the end of chapter 16, so we'll see how long that lasts. There are a few things for you to know about before we head into the chapter. One is that the word pathetic doesn't always mean pathetic in the modern sense, where it's kind of sad, overwhelmingly sad. This actually is being used in today's chapter in the Aristotelian sense of pathos, which is something that would lead you to feel sad for someone or a situation or feel pity, but not pathetic like the way it gets used. Oh, that is so pathetic. Like over the top, makes you angry. It's so sad, or presented in such a way as to pull all the levers and make you feel emotion. It's not that. It is just an emotional state of sadness. There is a reference to knit lace. Now, there is a difference between knit lace and lace knitting. Knitted lace has a rest row. That means you will knit all the holes and fiddly bits and all the special stuff on one row, and then you will knit back plain, probably purling, but not always purling back. So that's knit lace. Lace knitting is where there is patterning on every row, meaning you have the yarn overs and the knit two togethers and all of the fiddly bits going both directions, regardless. There is no rest for the lace knitter. You'll hear a reference to slate water. I'm sure you know what this is. If you have a slate, the best way to clean it off, to clean the slate pencil and chalk marks off of it, would be with water. So you'd have a little rag, you'd have a little bottle or container of slate water in, around, or on your desk. Slate pencils actually were different. They are, in fact, pieces of slate. These were soft slate. They would make kind of a bluish gray mark onto the slate tablet, which was usually kind of on the black side of things. And sometimes these would come decorated, wrapped in decorative paper or even protective coating, but that's what a slate pencil is. There are two words you are going to hear juxtaposed to each other, fearfully and wonderfully. And if you think, that doesn't, Anne uses big words. She gets busted for using big words. But that doesn't really sound necessarily like Anne. And you would be right, because that's actually a psalm. And if you want to look it up, look up 139:14. So Psalm 139, line 14 is the one that contains the phrase fearfully and wonderfully. And then, just in case you have forgotten your history, Waterloo. The Battle of Waterloo was Napoleon's big defeat. So when somebody talks about their own personal Waterloo, they are talking about their own personal biggest defeat. And that's all there is. That's it. Let's listen to chapter 17 of Anne of Green Gables, read for us by Kim Zuckert.
Anne of Green Gables by Lucy Maud Montgomery, read by Kim Zuckert. Chapter 17, A New Interest in Life. The next afternoon, Anne, bending over her patchwork at the kitchen window, happened to glance out and beheld Diana down by the Dryad's bubble, beckoning mysteriously. In a trice, Anne was out of the house and flying down to the hollow, astonishment and hope struggling in her expressive eyes. But the hope faded when she saw Diana's dejected countenance. "Your mother hasn't relented?" she gasped. Diana shook her head mournfully. "No, and oh, Anne, she says I'm never to play with you again. I've cried, and I told her it wasn't your fault, but it wasn't any use. I had ever such a time coaxing her to let me come down and say goodbye to you. She said I was only to stay 10 minutes, and she's timing me by the clock." "10 minutes isn't very long to say an eternal farewell in," said Anne tearfully. "Oh, Diana, will you promise faithfully never to forget me, the friend of your youth, no matter what dearer friends may caress thee?" "Indeed I will," sobbed Diana, "and I'll never have another bosom friend. I don't want to have. I couldn't love anybody as I love you." "Oh, Diana," cried Anne, clasping her hands, "do you love me?" "Why, of course I do. Didn't you know that?" "No." Anne drew a long breath. "I knew you liked me, of course, but I never hoped you loved me." "Why, Diana, I didn't think anybody could love me. Nobody has ever loved me since I can remember. Oh, this is wonderful. It's a ray of light which will forever shine on the darkness of a path severed from thee, Diana. Oh, just say it once again." "I love you devotedly, Anne," said Diana staunchly. "And I always will. You may be sure of that." "And I will always love thee, Diana," said Anne, solemnly extending her hand. "In the years to come, thy memory will shine like a star over my lonely life, as that last story we read together says. Diana, wilt thou give me a lock of thy jet-black tresses in parting to treasure forevermore? Have you got anything to cut it with? Queried Diana, wiping away the tears which Anne's affecting accents had caused to flow afresh, and returning to practicalities. Yes, I've got my patchwork scissors in my apron pocket, fortunately, said Anne. She solemnly clipped one of Diana's curls. Fare thee well, my beloved friends. Henceforth we must be as strangers, though living side by side, but my heart will ever be faithful to thee. Anne stood and watched Diana out of sight, mournfully waving her hand to the latter whenever she turned back to look. Then she returned to the house, not a little consoled for the time being by this romantic parting. It is all over, she informed Marilla. I shall never have another friend. I'm really worse off than ever before, for I haven't Katie Morris and Violetta now, and even if I had it wouldn't be the same. Somehow, little dream girls are not satisfying after a real friend. Diana and I had such an affecting farewell down by the spring. It will be sacred in my memory forever. I used the most pathetic language I could think of and said thou and thee. Thou and thee seems so much more romantic than you. Diana gave me a lock of her hair, and I'm going to sew it up in a little bag and wear it around my neck all my life. Please see that it is buried with me, for I don't believe I'll live very long. Perhaps when she sees me lying cold and dead before her, Mrs. Barry may feel remorse for what she has done, and will let Diana come to my funeral. I don't think there's much fear of you dying of grief as long as you can talk, Anne, said Marilla unsympathetically. The following Monday Anne surprised Marilla by coming down from her room with her basket of books on her arm and lips primmed up into a line of determination. I'm going back to school, she announced. That is all there is left in life for me, now that my friend has been ruthlessly torn from me. In school I can look at her and muse over days departed. You'd better muse over your lessons and sums, said Marilla, concealing her delight at this development of the situation. If you're going back to school, I suppose we'll hear no more of breaking slates over people's heads and such carryings on. Behave yourself and do just what your teacher tells you. I'll try to be a model pupil, agreed Anne dolefully. There won't be much fun in it, I expect. Mr. Phillips said Minnie Andrews was a model pupil, and there isn't a spark of imagination or life in her. She's just dull and poky and never seems to have a good time. But I feel so depressed that perhaps it will come easy to me now. I'm going round by the road. I couldn't bear to go by the birch path all alone. I should weep bitter tears if I did. Anne was welcomed back to school with open arms. Her imagination had been sorely missed in games, her voice in the singing, and her dramatic ability in the perusal aloud of books at dinner hour. Ruby Gillis smuggled 3 blue plums over to her during Testament reading. Ella May McPherson gave her an enormous yellow pansy cut from the covers of a floral catalogue, a species of desk decoration much prized in Avonlea School. Sophia Sloane offered to teach her a perfectly elegant new pattern of knit lace, so nice for trimming aprons. Katie Bolter gave her a perfume bottle to keep slate water in, and Julia Bell copied carefully on a piece of pale pink paper, scalloped on the edges, the following effusion. When twilight drops her curtain down and pins it with a star, remember that you have a friend, though she may wander far. It's so nice to be appreciated, sighed Anne rapturously to Marilla that night. The girls were not the only scholars who appreciated her. When Anne went to her seat after dinner hour, she had been told by Mr. Phillips to sit with the model Minnie Andrews, she found on her desk a big, luscious strawberry apple. Anne caught it up, all ready to take a bite, when she remembered that the only place in Avonlea where strawberry apples grew was in the old Blythe orchard on the other side of the Lake of Shining Waters. Anne dropped the apple as if it were a red-hot coal, and ostentatiously wiped her fingers on her handkerchief. The apple lay untouched on her desk until the next morning, when little Timothy Andrews, who swept the school and kindled the fire, annexed it as one of his perquisites. Charlie Sloane's slate pencil, gorgeously bedizened with striped red and yellow paper, costing 2 cents where ordinary pencils cost only 1, which he sent up to her after dinner hour, met with a more favorable reception. Anne was graciously pleased to accept it, and rewarded the donor with a smile which exalted that infatuated youth straightway into the seventh heaven of delight, and caused him to make such fearful errors in his dictation that Mr. Phillips kept him in after school to rewrite it. But, as the Caesar's pageant shorn of Brutus's bust did but of Rome's best son remind her more, so the marked absence of any tribute or recognition from Diana Barry, who was sitting with Gertie Pye, embittered Anne's little triumph. "Diana might just have smiled at me once, I think," she mourned to Marilla that night. But the next morning a note, most fearfully and wonderfully twisted and folded, and a small parcel were passed across to Anne. "Dear Anne," ran the former, "Mother said I'm not to play with you or talk to you even in school. It isn't my fault, and don't be cross at me, because I love you as much as ever. I miss you awfully to tell all my secrets to, and I don't like Gertie Pye one bit. I made you one of the new bookmarkers out of red tissue paper. They are awfully fashionable now, and only 3 girls in school know how to make them. When you look at it, remember your true friend, Diana Barry." Anne read the note, kissed the bookmark, and dispatched a prompt reply back to the other side of the school. "My own darling Diana, of course I'm not cross with you because you have to obey your mother. Our spirits can commune. I shall keep your lovely present forever. Minnie Andrews is a very nice little girl, although she has no imagination, but after having been Diana's bosom friend, I cannot be Minnie's. Please excuse mistakes because my spelling isn't very good yet, although much improved. Yours until death us do part, Anne or Cordelia Shirley. P.S. I shall sleep with your letter under my pillow tonight. A or C.S." Marilla pessimistically expected more trouble, since Anne had again begun to go to school, but none developed. Perhaps Anne caught something of the model spirit from Minnie Andrews. At least she got on very well with Mr. Phillips thenceforth. She flung herself into her studies heart and soul, determined not to be outdone in any class by Gilbert Blythe. The rivalry between them was soon apparent. It was entirely good-natured on Gilbert's side, but it is much to be feared that the same cannot be said of Anne, who had certainly an unpraiseworthy tenacity for holding grudges. She was as intense in her hatreds as in her loves. She would not stoop to admit that she meant to rival Gilbert in schoolwork, because that would have been to acknowledge his existence, which Anne persistently ignored. But the rivalry was there, and honors fluctuated between them. Now Gilbert was head of the spelling class. Now Anne, with a toss of her long braids, spelled him down. One morning Gilbert had all his sums done correctly and had his name written on the blackboard on the roll of honor. The next morning Anne, having wrestled wildly with decimals the entire evening before, would be first. One awful day they were ties, and their names were written up together. It was almost as bad as to take notice, and Anne's mortification was as evident as Gilbert's satisfaction. When the written examinations at the end of each month were held, the suspense was terrible. The first month, Gilbert came out 3 marks ahead. The second, Anne beat him by 5. But her triumph was marred by the fact that Gilbert congratulated her heartily before the whole school. It would have been ever so much sweeter to her if he had felt the sting of his defeat. Mr. Phillips might not be a very good teacher, but a pupil so inflexibly determined on learning as Anne could hardly escape making progress under any kind of teacher. By the end of the term, Anne and Gilbert were both promoted into the 5th class, and allowed to begin studying the elements of the branches, by which Latin, geometry, French, and algebra were meant. In geometry, Anne met her Waterloo. "It's perfectly awful stuff, Marilla," she groaned. "I'm sure I'll never be able to make head or tail of it. There's no scope for imagination in it at all. Mr. Phillips said I'm the worst dunce he ever saw at it. And some of the others are so smart at it. It is extremely mortifying, Marilla. Even Diana gets along better than I do. But I don't mind being beaten by Diana. Even although we meet as strangers now, I still love her with an inextinguishable love. It makes me very sad at times to think about her. But really, Marilla, one can't stay sad very long in such an interesting world, can one?" End of chapter 17.
I am in total agreement with Anne. Geometry, well, not so much geometry. Math was my Waterloo, although I'm learning math much better now because my husband has had to learn math better now because he keeps doing all this research on math education and math pedagogy. And as a consequence, I have actually started to understand numbers, which sounds so stupid, right? I mean, 50 years old, for God's sake, woman, learn some math. I don't mean that. I've got all the way up through trig and pre-calculus. I mean that if I did something wrong in math on a test, I couldn't figure out on my own necessarily what it was that I had done incorrectly because I didn't understand the math behind the math well enough. Like, why is the Pythagorean theorem what it is? Why does that magic always work? Whereas in a piece of writing, if something got marked on an essay when I was in school, I could probably figure out, especially if I asked my mom, I could probably figure out how to make it better, fix it, or at least improve it. I wasn't like that with math, and it's a shame. All this to say, I sure empathize with Anne and her problem with geometry. And a few of you might have noticed there was a quote in this week's chapter. The Caesar's pageant shorn of Brutus' bust did but of Rome's best son remind her more. That's actually from Childe Harold, which is Lord Byron's Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. It's one of his epic poems that he penned. And I know some of you have read Don Juan and maybe even Childe Harold, so I thought I'd point that out to you. I have a couple of emails that I have been sitting on, not for any good reason, just because they were in the back of the book and I didn't notice them. So I'm going to share the emails with you now. The first came from Christine, who you may recall did the Tin of Tans for us ages ago. So hello, Christine. She wrote, Dear Heather, I think I'd read a reference to Anne of Green Gables in a Sunday school paper. My mom and Grandma Clark had grown up on Laura Ingalls Wilder, and I hadn't heard of Anne. I think Mrs. Brock at the Nyack Public Library helped me find a copy when I was in 4th grade. The collection at the time did not have all the books. Once I skimmed my way through the first chapter with the long stream descriptions and Mrs. Rachel, who I initially disliked as much as Anne did, I felt that I was Anne. She used big words, and she was always being shushed up by bored adults who just didn't understand. The idea that she started using smaller words and being aware of social turn-taking in conversation was lost on me until many rereads later. Sincerely, Christine. I empathize with that so much, Christine. And what a great librarian you had. And yay you for hearing a reference to the book in Sunday school and then going and hunting it down. Well done, you. And then from our longtime friend, Julie at Forgotten Classics. I, too, am a Laura Ingalls girl and liked Anne of Green Gables well enough, but never read more than the first book, while I practically memorized the Little House books. At any rate, I wanted to draw your attention to The Blue Castle, which LMM wrote for adults. It definitely features a woman too smart for her own good. I found the end to be way too idealized, but after hearing about her marriage, I can see the inspiration for it. Cheers, Julie. So, The Blue Castle, take a look. Have a great one. I'll talk to you soon. Bye. A big thanks to all the Craftlit listeners who support the show by being a premium audio member via craftlit.com/premium or via patreon.com/craftlit. Your support for the show is what's kept us going since 2006. If you feel like getting free audio pretty much every week, please consider supporting the show by heading over to patreon.com/craftlit and pledging what you feel the show is worth to you. If you can't support the show that way, consider leaving a review at iTunes or at our facebook.com/craftlit page, or follow at Craftlit on Twitter and share the show with your followers too. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.